Dearest friends and colleagues, it's a wonderful pleasure to be with you today thanks to Skype technology and at least celebrate vicariously the 20th anniversary of the ICRAF Southeast Asia program. I'm sure that many of you in the audience today are old colleagues with whom I've spent years of time when I lived in Bogor, but unfortunately technology doesn't permit me to see you. So I can't quite tell from my vantage point who among my old friends is actually there. But anniversaries are about reminiscing. So allow me to do a bit of that this morning. They're also about looking ahead, and I will take a few moments of time to do that as well. In 1992, ICRAF had been in existence for about 14 years. But did not have a real presence anywhere in Asia. When I was called upon to launch the regional program, I moved from the Philippines, where I had been leading the farming systems program at the International Rice Research Institute, and I felt mighty overwhelmed by it all. Moving to Indonesia, setting up our program offices was an enormous task. And as I moved onto the campus of the Forest Research Institute, it was Pa Gintings that was my lifeline. Of course, Pa Gintings, you must be there in the audience, and you were the guy who kept my sanity during those initial months and years of all of the arrangements that were necessary to operate effectively under the Indonesian situation. Chun Lai was there in the Forest Research Institute also as the coordinator of the Asia-Pacific Agroforestry Network. And we started our office in a little back room at the Apan building, which existed at that time. And I was joined very soon after by the able Suzy Sarakman, who administered our program and started our administrative operations. But it wasn't long after that Pa Maina joined me, and we began an amazing friendship, he and I, and working relationship that has continued over the past 2 decades. Tom Tomic joined us soon after that as our economist for the region, and we began to build a truly exceptional team. Our little team expanded rapidly. We soon had to move to bigger quarters, and we were graciously provided the whole top floor of a research building on the Forest Research campus. It was a very nice facility, but it was not long after that that we had the great dipterocarp tree disaster. Those of you who have been working with ICRAF since the mid-90s will well remember that day. It was a terrific rainstorm one afternoon, high winds like we had never seen in Bogor, and a massive old tree smashed through the top floor of the building and cut the building like a knife through butter. The whole roof collapsed, and all of our staff were in the offices at that time. It was a miracle that no one was killed or seriously wounded in that event, although a few folks did end up in the hospital for tests and surface wounds. But I guess if something terrible was to happen to ICRAF, it's only poetic justice that it would be a tree that would be the cause of the ill. But we all survived, thank God, and the driving frame for our regional program began to develop during those early years. It was focused specifically on the forest margins and the challenges of the development of alternatives to slash and burn. The ASB program provided the platform by which our entire regional research agenda was formulated. And we began work in a number of locations around Indonesia, particularly in Sumatra and Kalimantan, where we began looking at the development of a way of understanding the options for land use systems in the tropical forest margins. Our work evolved into what became known quite famously globally as the ASB matrix, a set of tools for analyzing both the biophysical and economic aspects of land use choices on the tropical margins, which have been used extensively as both data sets and methodologies in the succeeding years. An exercise that we're quite proud of to have contributed with our colleagues from all over Indonesia and many other countries throughout the tropics. Indeed, the ASB partnership has become a truly boundaryless organization, an example of a kind of partnership that spans the globe and is not rooted in any one organization, but a means of building synergies among expertise throughout the world. As an agronomist and agroecologist, I was particularly intrigued by the Imperata grasslands challenges in Indonesia and the region as a whole. I was particularly proud to have our team involved in organizing a major conference in Indonesia during the mid-90s, which produced a book and a set of analyses of how, in fact, a problem which was conceived as being the rehabilitation of wastelands was misconceived, and that the Imperata grasslands, by and large, were areas that could be quite productive if, in fact, land tenure was addressed and people who lived on the land had control of its future and enabled to manage the land instead of allowing it to burn each year, which was the reason that the Imperata grasslands developed in the first place. Well, that story has become important these days as we deal with the challenges of oil palm development along a pathway of low carbon emissions, particularly as we see the enormous potential for Indonesia's peatlands to emit carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases beyond any land use systems anywhere else in the world. And as land use systems carbon emissions decrease in many parts of the world, and globally they are decreasing gradually, we note that the peatlands present a huge risk for greenhouse emissions, and the Imperata grasslands, which we began studying together with Indonesian colleagues so long ago, now become a center of attraction for the development of the peatland, of an alternative to the peatlands for development of oil palm and other plantation crops. Well, a couple of years after ICRAF started up in Bogor, and we began to staff up and establish our programs, we were joined by Jeff Sayer, Director General Designate for the C4, which was just arriving to begin operations at that time. The Indonesian government, during the discussions with C4, was very gracious and offered ICRAF the opportunity to build a building on the campus of C4, which was paid for entirely by the government as it set up the campus for the C4 operations. This was very generous and allowed us to then imagine the growth potential for ICRAF and its team in the region. And I was asked how much space we needed, and I recall putting together a plan for a building of about 650 square meters and submitted that to our Indonesian hosts and to C4. When my boss, the Director General at ICRAF at that time, Pedro Sanchez, who many of you remember well, got word of this, he was upset. He couldn't imagine that ICRAF in Southeast Asia could possibly make use of that much space. And yet I was sure that at the rate that our team could grow in terms of achieving its mission, we would be lucky if we didn't need more space than that. Well, as I said, Pedro was pretty put out by the possibility of that much space and that large a building. But he relented, and we went ahead. Indonesia built the facility for us. And by golly, within 1 year after we moved into our new quarters, we had entirely filled up the building with our growing staff and projects and collaborators and associates and consultants and secondments, and a wonderful team of people who came together during those days. Meanwhile, of course, this was a regional program, and we started our work in other countries under the framework of the ASB. We began first in the Philippines, where I personally had a long history of working, and began to actually assume some of the research programs that at that time the International Rice Research Institute was quite interested to share with us, or to divulge with us, in terms of both the ASB program and the SANREM, or Sustainable Agriculture and Natural Resources Management program. And I was joined by staff transferred from Erie to rapidly begin building up our work in the Philippines. But we also began operations in northern Thailand under ASB, with Dr. David Thomas leading the work. And a few years later, we began to make our presence felt in China, working with the National Chinese Academy of Sciences in Kunming in southwestern China, and eventually in Vietnam as well. So with those, we became gradually a fully regionalized program based in Bogor. The ICRAF Southeast Asia team grew from strength to strength. We soon became the largest regional program of the World Agroforestry Center, and we were quite proud of the developments that we were able to achieve in that growth period. Indeed, I think Mina would probably agree that we were the mavericks of ICRAF. We were the risk takers. We were questioning everything. We were always on the red carpet with the Director General about our ways of developing in new directions and taking new ideas to fruition in Southeast Asia. Well, indeed, finally, I think the ICRAF administration and board decide that if they couldn't keep us under control, they'd better kick me upstairs to Nairobi, and they could keep an eye on me there. And so, indeed, through some very curious experiences, I was appointed as Director General from Regional Coordinator and came to Nairobi in 2001, where indeed they've been able to keep a closer watch on me ever since. Well, during the turn of the century, I recall that our work and our attention shifted quite dramatically towards the issues of environmental services in the uplands of Southeast Asia. And at that time, we started the quite unique and interesting network, which is now called RUPES, or Rewarding the Upland Poor for Environmental Services. And in the context of doing that and collaborating with IFAD and many, many other partners in both the conservation and development community in developing that network of activity throughout the region, we began to recognize the huge challenges that exist in developing rewards for environmental services as a means of negotiating agreements between those farmers and rural people living upstream at higher elevations vis-a-vis the more urban and agricultural communities using irrigation facilities downstream. And that set of experiences helped us to evolve into a whole set of decision tools that have come to be known as negotiation support services, or negotiation support systems, I should say. And under the leadership of Chip Fay, who so ably worked with us and the Ministry of Forestry in terms of policy change during those years, we began to build and test these methods of negotiation support services. And as I understand, they have been applied quite liberally throughout many parts of Indonesia as we looked to the development of the means by which rural people could be recognized for the efforts that they put into conserving the environment as they go about their agricultural activities. Well, today we face a whole range of major challenges and opportunities in the world of agroforestry. We are seeing transitions, agroforest transitions in many countries that are really putting serious effort in the region to the development of tree cover. We know that China, the Philippines, Thailand, other countries have actually passed through a tree cover transition in which deforestation has developed into a net increase in tree cover. Not always, of course, with natural regeneration, but at least the development of tree cover through agroforestry. It is true, as we look at the enormous challenges of addressing climate change, that more and more people from various fields are seeing agroforestry as the answer to the development of carbon or climate smart means of production systems. I just got back from a conference in South Africa last week in which we are working to develop a new global alliance on climate smart agriculture to fill the void that has been sadly developed because the world is failing to negotiate adequate agreements to control greenhouse gas emissions. And the thought is now that those countries and organizations that are willing to make the commitments to move forward could do so voluntarily under a new alliance that would enable us to make progress while the negotiations continue to be bogged down. I think climate change is certainly one of ICRAF's most important areas of contribution in the coming years, and I look forward to the continued innovations and rigorous science that is backstopping the regional program's work in collaborating with the government of Indonesia and the other countries of the region. Indeed, I'm proud to say that the Southeast Asia program that has been so ably led by Meinovan Nordwick and Ujwal Pradhan during the past decade since I departed for Nairobi has continued to grow from strength to strength in its science, in its leadership, in its policy and development impact. I'm very proud of that achievement, that set of achievements, and I look forward to those continuing under the able leadership and engagement of our staff in the region and our many wonderful collaborators with whom we have worked and depended upon to progress together in solving problems that make a great deal of difference to millions around the world. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to hearing about who actually was there during our celebrations this morning and who we will continue to be working with over the coming years. Thanks again. Terima kasih.